All right. Okay, folks. Welcome to, this is the beginning of this section on an open class section on C.S. Lewis, The Four Loves and Gender. And as people are signing on and as we want to kind of have an open discussion, I wanted to figure out just a little teaser exercise that I thought would be kind of fun while we're waiting for everything to kind of begin. Yeah, thank you, Takako, there. We are going to be recording this session, and so you want to think about how you want to present yourself in conversation. I'll touch on that in a couple of minutes. But what I wanted to do was kind of a funny exercise. I'm going to share my screen here. Yeah, let's actually do this. I'm going to share this document, this box here. Hopefully this works for everybody, that you can see my my Word document. It's waiting for the screen here. And what I have, actually that's totally not working. What I'm going to do is change that and share monitor one. There we go. So what I'm going to do for right now is do kind of a little fun exercise where I take the transcription of C.S. Lewis and the Four Loves and just look up a word that kind of caught my imagination while I was listening to it, re-listening to the lectures that were available. And the word that kind of caught my mind was the word thousand. And so I think this is kind of an interesting word, and I'm curious about how Lewis uses it. For example, he says, thousands of people have lived and died without knowing it. Here we're talking about eros versus storge. Eros being erotic love, storge being kind of family love. It's interesting. Thousands of people have died. Like, I wonder what kind of concept he has of the world, that he imagines the past as thousands of people. It's kind of an intriguing thing if you think about it. And here he's talking about 900 of each thousand will have had what we call friends, but not necessarily what he calls filial love, which is a little bit deeper. Okay, so that's fine. So his concept of the world in the past, the people that have lived and died, is thousands. So that's kind of interesting. Let's keep going. What else do we have? The public opinion of a group may be tiny, but it matters more than the opinion of 10,000 outsiders. That's kind of an interesting concept, isn't it? Your friends will always matter more than that. That's kind of a neat thing. And then this famous phrase of Lewis's, every knot of friends is thus a resistant movement. That's a pretty cool quote. Great quotable moment that's there. Okay, what else does he say about thousands? This is amazing. Thousands of generations of our ancestors were married off in early youth to partners chosen by their parents with whom they were not in love. And this is one of my favorite moments. Dozens of them were good people and kept their vows. I mean, think about the scope of that, right? We've got thousands of people that have had this experience in history of being married through fixed marriages, and thousands of them were good people and kept their vows, and dozens were good people and kept their vows. I would hope that marital fidelity is a little higher than a, say, 1 in 12 chance. Just I'm hoping historically that it's a little bit higher than that. What else do we have for thousands? Here we're talking about a scriptural moment, and thousands of people have this particular scriptural kind of reading. So that's kind of interesting. He means that just generally, I think that's the public view in a lot of people's minds. And then here he talks about Anna Karenina and Vronsky and Tolstoy's novel, the classic novel, about love and infidelity and kind of the loss of self that takes place in the throwing oneself into that kind of moment. And then he talks about dangers are averted by thousands of couples. Again, I don't know who these thousands of couples are. And then I want to give this one last moment here. 1,000 miles for Lewis is kind of like the end of the world. He's talking about making himself safe. He's talking about making sure that there's no risks in his life, making sure that, all the choices that he makes are safe choices, that he's never taking a risk beyond himself. He's not throwing himself down. He's not stepping out too far, that the safest bet for him is the low interest safe loan. And yet, of course, he says, when I feel this, I'm not, when I say I want to avoid all suffering, I know that I'm not saying the best thing. I'm just talking about me. When I respond to this natural appeal, I feel myself to be 1,000 miles away from the spirit of Christianity. If I'm certain of anything, I'm sure that Christ did not teach in order to confirm my congenital preference for safe investment. So anyway, so I thought, just because we have a bit of a controversial topic tonight that we want to talk about, the four loves and gender, C.S. Lewis, writing 60 years ago, a text that we're going to dig out and talk about a little bit. I thought it would be kind of fun to make fun of him just a wee bit and kind of qualify it. Already we have a couple of great comments here. One, Lewis probably didn't feel confident enough to say millions, and I actually did a text search, and he rarely uses millions in any of his talks. He tends to use thousands, and occasionally a thousand thousands is maybe how a British person in 1950 would say a million. And then someone else says thousands seems appropriate as a quantifier for someone who's a medievalist, right? And that's interesting, right? One of the few times that Lewis said the word million, when he was talking about one astronomer who thought the sun was like 127 million miles away. This is a medieval astronomer. So there we go. All right. Okay. So I want to we're just having a little fun to get going, and then we'll kind of dig into some of the more difficult bits or some of the queries we have in this conversation. But I wanted to kind of set a few contextual rules so that we're all kind of playing in the same game here. My name is Brenton Dickieson. I'm a professor at Signum University, a preceptor and lecturer, in particular in the class C.S. Lewis and Mythologies of Love and Sex, a class that we wanted to open up our doors on for kind of one night and see who wants to come in and peek to your own peril, I'm sure. And so what we wanted to do in opening this up, though, is also kind of protect ourselves a little bit. We are recording this class, and so tonight you are totally welcome in order to use a pseudonym, if you like. And to do that, simply when you go into the question box, you simply put like a different name at the beginning of your conversation. So if you're going to be, say, Thor as your pseudonym, as one might do, you just put Thor and then colon and then your comment, and I'll do my best to call you Thor. Even then, I will only be using the first names as we go through the conversation tonight, the names that show up first, and some of those may actually be pseudonyms and how you showed up. So you're welcome to kind of be anonymous in this conversation. I'm also going to take another kind of risk in actually open up your microphones and have you self-mute them, but allow you to actually speak and share your voice and your thoughts by using the hand-raising feature. This is underneath the participants box in your GoToWebinar dashboard, and if you want to chat, you simply just raise your hands and I will get there. And I have Professor Gabriel Schenk is sitting quietly. Do you want to just say hello, Gabriel?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'll just say hello to everyone. You can't see me, but I'm here, and I'm just a kind of wingman, I suppose, if that's the right term. I'm just kind of a co-panelist, keeping a track of the comments. So do not be afraid to write loads and loads of things, because my job is just to read everything and just to make sure that Brenton hasn't missed anything. So I might pop in at times. I might have opinions on some of the things as well. I might butt in with my own opinions, but you might also hear me just say, oh, Brenton, I think you might have missed this point. But we'll see how we go.
Yeah, excellent. And that's precisely what we wanted. And the only way that Gabriel can get in is if he speaks. There's no kind of hands up for him. So as part of that, I'm about to unmute everyone. So just get ready. If you happen to be like in a coffee shop or you're taking care of children, or you're like a traffic cop, and you're just listening to this, on your iPhone, then you'll probably want to remute yourself. Let me just see, where we go. So I'm about to unmute everybody. So just go ahead and remute yourselves if you would like to do so. And actually, I would like generally for people to keep themselves muted. If that's and then, and you're going to hear all kinds of interesting things in the next minute as we work this out. And then what will happen is if you want to speak, you just kind of raise your hand, unlike Gabriel, who will just kind of shout out. And then when you're ready to speak, I'll recognize you. Just say your first name. And then we'll go from there. So once again, this is recorded, so do feel free to engage well, but just feel free to engage pseudonymously if you want that. And I'm looking at the conversation questions here, and we're going to be looking at the hands up question box. And so I'm going to be trying to hold this all together tonight. Okay, so what we want out of this conversation, what do we want out of this conversation? Well, I mean, this is a wee bit of a challenging book to deal with. The Four Loves is a lecture series and a series of talks that C.S. Lewis did. And 1958, he did the talks, and the book came out a couple of years later. What he wanted to do is was basically capture four loves, the concept of four loves. And these four loves are simply storge, which is affection, familial love; philia, which is friendship love; eros, which is erotic love; and then agape, which he calls the Christian love or divine love, but I've expanded in my class to think of as self-sacrificial love. So that's what he wanted to kind of do, to capture those different ideas of love, and then talk about them. And it was a book that he had in his mind for 20 or 25 years, and it was really when he fell in love, when he met and married a woman, probably his first love, although not his first relationship. In his late 50s, he met and married and fell in love and decided to get married, and then he decided to do this lecture series. And this lecture series, I think, is largely with his wife, Joy Davidman, who was a poet. She was part of the process of writing, and she actually owned the copyright, unusually, to this book, unlike most of the things that he produced. She kept the particular copyright. So it's kind of an interesting experience, a kind of a fun book. It's a super quotable book. I've got dozens of quotes on my screen that I can begin with. But what we can't always do in a classroom, I mean, it's hard to talk about Christian theology, which is what this is, in a classroom. That's not in a seminary or even a religious studies program. It's in a literature program in a secular digital university. It's also a little challenging. I can't see your eyeballs, you can see mine. So we want to be able to share openly, but in a way that's safe and helpful and generative and conversational. And some things shockingly have changed, haven't they, in 60 years, right? So this is this is where we are. And so I wanted to open this up. Gender has moved dramatically in a cultural way in this period of time. Sex and sexuality has changed a lot in this period of time, and there are differences between the United States, which was the original audience for this particular program of lectures, and Britain, where Lewis actually lived and worked, and in the various places would be listened to today, including Canada, which has a different social politic than either Britain or the US, where I am. Okay, so this is where we're at. Once again, as we go into this conversation, you're welcome to use a pseudonym if you're writing notes here. You are unmuted, so do mute yourself if you want, if that would be best, and then raise your hand if you want to do the conversation. Okay, so let's do a little poll, a straw poll, to practice the hand raising thing. Okay, so raise your hand if you've read the book or heard the lecture series before, the Four Loves. So go ahead and use a little hand raising thing. Okay, well, excellent. This is most everybody. Okay, raise your hand. Nobody else will say this. I'll keep this secret. Go ahead and unraise your hands. Can I click to lower all hands? Oh, I can do that. Good. So raise your hands if you've never got through the lectures or book before, but you're just kind of here interested in the topic. So I just kind of know where you're at. Yeah, okay, good. All right. And so now we're going to do a different kind of vote. I can see these. Nobody else can see these. Well, Gabriel can see these. I want to kind of like who's kind of more interested in the Lewis side and who's more interested in the love and sex side. So let's begin. Well, who's more interested in the Lewis side? You're kind of a Lewis reader and you're just curious about what he was thinking about and how this might work out in his materials. Okay, good stuff. So a handful of people. Get it, a handful of people. All right, I'm gonna unraise your hand, and who's more interested in gender as a question, cultural question that you're kind of curious about? Okay, good. Oh, interesting. Okay, so a little stronger on the cultural question. That's neat. That's curious for me. So actually, well, let's go ahead and raise your hand if it's actually you're here for both, and I shouldn't have asked you a question that made you choose between one or the other. Yeah, okay, good. There we go. Actually, that's most of the people that put their hand up for gender are interested in both. Okay, good. Okay, so let's begin. Where do we want to begin? Let's begin with quotations. Now, I have with me the text to both the lecture and the book. You may have read or encountered either of those. And so I'm okay kind of looking up. Yeah, over here in the comments, it's like both, why do you make me choose? Don't do this. So let's begin with quotations, which Kay says is always the right choice. Yeah, that's right. Thank you for telling me I've done the right thing. After I've done it. So it's always more awkward when I haven't done the right thing. So let's go ahead and begin this conversation. Is there a quotation? Is there a thought that you'd like to bring out that you think that the community would just kind of dig, that this is one that you want to share with the community that they might enjoy? So you can go ahead and raise your hand and just say, oh, the thing about the thing, or you can actually read the quote, or you can kind of share it in the box. So I'll put this back over to the class here. So you can raise your hand to share a quote or ask me to find a quote. Okay, yeah, let's go ahead, Liz. Why don't you, you're unmuted, so go ahead and click your own mic. Yeah.
Okay, so I don't have the quote exactly, but I think the thing that's most intriguing to me is that when a love gets to be closest to the divine is when it becomes potentially the most problematic. When you start seeing the divine in your love, that's when it can become the demon.
Yeah.
I find that very interesting, but I don't doubt it. I think that there's truth in that.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's a quote. So the whole you're right. I mean, really, Liz, you struck on one of the key theses, I guess, that he's running with, which is love itself is a good and beautiful thing. But when we elevate it past the natural, that's when we get into trouble. And he gives various caricatures throughout the books and the lectures of that trouble, and he steals it from Denis de Rougemont, which is love ceases to be a demon only when he ceases to be a god. And then so he puts it in the more positive sense, it begins to be a demon the moment he begins to be a god. So
Right.
So yeah.
But I think there's still he gets onto it where there's subtly different, where it's almost like you can get into a relationship and it's not that you're like, I'm worshiping love. It's something where it can be simple, it can be friendship. And then you start seeing like this is very special and the divine starts to happen. And instead of pursuing it in a healthy way, it becomes the thing that twists the relationship.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's an interesting thing too about Lewis, right? Is he's saying, like in general, I think the greatest dangers are not what we would call big sins, but the things that are closest to beautiful and good things that get twisted or turned.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's actually a prescient moment, and I think one that's actually an interesting question for beyond just a particular religious framework, right? Is that actually true in the world? Are we in more danger in these bigger what does he say? He actually says like, yeah, the closer it comes to being divine, the closer we are to idolatry or something like that.
Something like that. Yeah.
Good. Okay. Thanks, Liz. Kay, did you have a thought that you wanted to add for that?
Yeah, I was curious about this concept of the approach to divinity, like placing love on that kind of a position. and we often think of romantic love, but I'm thinking of some of the examples in his other writings, like Orwell and Psyche.
Yeah.
And it seems as though he often tries to figure forth images of different types of human love in which it becomes unbalanced, or it becomes something that takes too much space in the person's awareness and life, and that there becomes that kind of like that loss of the happy medium or something of that nature. And I'm curious whether, so, you know, if we're talking in this passage with love in the abstract, I wonder if it is possible to apply that as well to love of God.
Interesting. So do you, sorry, just to confirm what you mean there, Kay, so I get the part, like, do you think, like, are you asking whether there's a danger in loving God too much, or the divine love itself kind of skirts too high, or have I misunderstood you there?
The first one is what I'm wondering about, you know, because he's introducing this caution into us, you know, to like, oh, if you're beginning to care too much or to love the wrong way, you know, it's a, in some ways it's a, in some ways it has the effect of the parent who just says to their kid, be careful. And you're like, can you be more specific, you know?
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
And so that's sort of what I'm wondering here, you know, it says very little to say, don't love the wrong way, you know? And so I'm wondering, like, well, if he's introducing this caution into the different types of human loves, would he also apply it to religious fervor?
Yeah, okay, so yeah, I see, and that's, you know, that might even be a concept that I'm just looking up a word here that I thought of, and Emily has a quote here that might be interesting. Right, so he actually uses justice as one of the concepts that he has to caution the kind of thing that you're talking about, Kay. Although he doesn't talk about religious fervor, he does talk about in the book nationalism or patriotism. And he's really cautious about family love, right? Parents, fathers who expect too much love from their kids without giving any dignity, or mothers who kind of over control or whatever. And so he says defying mercy and justice. That's a word that he uses. Yeah, let me see. There's also another point. So the great rules that keep us in relationship with one another, the keeping or breaking of promises, on justice and injustice, charity and selfishness. So those are the kinds of things that I think, Kay, that he would say, or the ones that fill out this comment. And Emily found the quotation here that I wonder if Liz was sort of getting at. Our loves do not make their claim to divinity until the claim becomes plausible. It does not become plausible until there is them a real resemblance to God, to love himself. As in, you know, when our erotic love heightens to a point that it actually takes on this divine reality, that's then when we're most tempted to worship it, and when it can most cause us problems. Or parental love. I love our generation as parents, but we're kind of intense, you know? So we're kind of intense. And so Lewis would say, I think of religious fanaticism, which I don't know that he saw that much of in Britain in his lifetime, that, you know, that, well, I would still say, you know, keeping promises, justice, charity, you know, selflessness. Like he would still say those are the big things. Does that answer that at all? Okay, that's sort of only a partial answer, but
That does make sense, though. Yeah, and it seems like a topic he wasn't terribly verbose on, but it does make sense that those kinds of guidelines would most likely apply if he were to have done so.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and he didn't like, it's a brilliant book in a lot of ways, but we talked in class last week, you know, about the fact that there's really kind of things that Lewis is missing in his experience base that could be filled out by us. who have broader or different experiences, or are a little further along in timeline or whatever. So yeah, no, that's good. Yeah, we actually live in an age, of course, where religious extremism is a real tangible part of our reality. And in many cases, part of our families, or immediate or extended families of people we love, right? Who are committed to maybe not just religious, but to ideological extremism on various parts of the spectrum. So yeah, so I think the patriotism talk in chapter 2 of the book would be where he would want to go and say, okay, here are some limits. What makes this difficult or good or bad or whatever. Yeah, good. Yeah. All right. Any other kind of quotes? And we can start to move into things that are, things that make you go, things that are just on the wee bit edge of troublesome or curious. Go ahead, David, if you want to go ahead and speak.
The quotation is when he's speaking about how modern society denigrates friendship. He says, to the ancients, friendship seemed to be the happiest and most fully human of all loves, the crown of life and the school of virtue. The modern world, in comparison, ignores it. We admit, of course, that besides wife and family, a man needs a few friends. The very tone of the admission and the sort of acquaintanceships described as friendships show clearly that it's something quite marginal, not a main course in life's banquet.
Yeah. Can I add just a little bit? If I can find the quotation, just that adds. So this is one of the things about having the. This is the thing about having also the lectures here, adding to that the life's banquet, and then he says in the lectures, it's more for those people. Friendship is more like the bread you crumble almost unconsciously during your long dinner. It's one of the etc. Right, which I think adds nicely to the quotation you brought up there, David. Yeah. Did you have a thought on that, or you just were struck by it as a comment about friendship in our culture today?
As with a lot of stuff, when I read Lewis, I'm stunned for things that he was talking about back then and what he must think of today's society. This was pre-Facebook. This was pre all of the things of modernity that have moved us even further away from where it was in the 50s and 60s.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I mean, he's prophetic in some ways, and then other ways we're not even sure he was like in his own time, right? I mean, this is the thing. He's a pre-modernist, modernist, postmodernist figure. He's a cultural critic. He's resisting his age, but not fitting well into any age. So he's going to have that. Yeah, good.
And just whenever I give any of his quotations on friendship to people, it always makes them hungry, because he's describing something that they know they actually really want and typically don't really have. In England, they have a minister for loneliness. That is now part of the remit of a government minister. And in every single survey that you see, people say that they don't actually have close friends, particularly men.
Yeah.
We actually studied this book in our local C.S. Lewis book club, and just related to that, it kind of divided the group, because all of the men were just like 100% on board with everything he said about friendship. But a lot of the ladies in the group saying, this isn't quite everything.
No, that's right. I think there is, but okay. Well, I mean, I've always wondered, like, is it easier for men to experience friendship in our culture? Is it easier for women to experience friendship in our culture? I mean, now that we've sort of broken down the barriers, some of my best friends are people, right? Now that we've sort of broken down a lot of barriers of friendship that may have been there before in class or different kinds of culture or experience or gender, are we having better friendships? We have all the social media that allows us to facilitate friendships. Are we closer to one another? Or are we actually drifting apart? I don't know the answer to that, but I've also been curious about whether I've had a theory that I think that women in my generation are just a wee bit better at friendship than men in lasting kind of ways. But that's my thought. I would love to hear pushback on that. Go ahead, Kay, if you like.
I've come to think of it as not so much being, and of course I don't know if you necessarily meant this, but I've come to think of it as being much less something that is like an innate quality that is present or not present in either women or men. I think that, the human animal is capable of all forms of connection.
Hmm.
And I think sometimes the ways that we, it's sort of like on the nurture end of the debate, but it certainly does seem to me that the ways that we socialize males, especially in American society,
Mm-hmm.
we're kind of shutting down a lot of the things that make for a good friendship, sort of requiring men to hide or suppress emotion to only kind of project strength and competition and invulnerability. And so there are kind of like fewer avenues that we allow them to pursue in their lives, and it becomes narrowed to, you can have friends, like you can bond with other men over sports and a much narrower realm of activities. And if you're not naturally drawn to those, you're a little bit out of luck.
Yeah.
And I think that at least to me, that explains a lot more of sometimes the differences that we see in especially adult men and women, and the types of satisfactions that we are reporting in our friendships. I find it unsatisfying to conclude that, well, this is just, men are just incapable or less capable than women are of meaningful human connection. If nothing else, I look to the, just the depth of connection and passion that is shown in literature and say, well, of course, these are human capacities, of course they're present in men as well.
Yeah. And in other cultures, I mean, if you've been in the Middle East and you see men, kissing or holding hands, we know that we sit as an outlier, I think, in the West when it comes to contact, touch, certainly. And and when I say men, I say only men in my generation and in my culture. Although, I have lived in another culture where I wondered, I could never crack how even friendship worked in that culture, because men just worked together, it seemed. Yeah. So thanks for that, Kay. Trevor, did you have a response to that, or did you want to kind of think about something connected or a little different? Oh, you're muted, so you'll have to unmute.
Okay, sorry about that. No, I just had a quick response to that. This is something that's kind of been on my mind a lot. I think men generally there's a sense that we have to have something to bond about. Whereas I think women seem to have more of a gift of, and of course we're speaking glittering generalities here, I think women seem to feel much more comfortable just being like, there's only one person that I know of that I can call him up and say, let's just do something. Whereas I think my wife knows 25 people like that, and she feels no uncomfortableness about just simply calling somebody up. So I think that there's more of a maybe it's just a fear of it's a fear of risk. It's a fear of maybe we're more sensitive. I don't know.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, and I just want to, like, when you speaking of men and women, are you kind of speaking in the way that Kay kind of made the adjustment? Like, are you speaking kind of your time and culture, or are you actually thinking that this is a biological reality or something?
Well, I think that's just it. I think that this time period between Freud and maybe now it's starting to decrease as, we talk about bromance and homophobia is kind of settling down in some places. I think since Freud, there's always been this nervousness, I think, underneath. So I think it is more of a this generation, this century, or maybe more last century, because it is something that, I mean, you see these deep friendships between people, men, even in America and even in the West, just didn't seem to be quite as nervous about, having close friendships with other men.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think there's a thing there, again, without pushing the generalization too much. Well, what do folks think though of this? This is like one of the most powerful moments in yeah, and Kay's just saying the speaker in the Dream of the Rood talking about cuddling his king. Yeah, that's right. That's certainly a phrase we probably wouldn't go with. We have this yeah, that's right. I don't think I've cuddled many men, to be fair, and even the idea of it is kind of weird. Lewis addresses in the text and the lectures the people accusing people of homosexuality who love friendship or something like that. I'm missing out because okay, I'll go cuddle more kings. I'm in, and I'm more of like a fist bump to kings, Kay, to be fair. But Lewis says, the characteristic posture of lovers is face to face, and I think that's true, right? Although Lewis says elsewhere, remember that not all lovers' kisses are lovers' kisses. A lot of them are storge, relational, familial kisses. That the posture of friends is side by side. And in the book, he talks about walking down the road together, kind of facing an object, or even today, I would suggest mediating things. We have, like a coffee between us or a project or something. So I think that's I think that could be there. So that idea is there. No, so Hannah, you've got your hand up. I'm just gonna unclick you there, and you're muted. If you want to share, you can go ahead. You can respond to Trevor and sort of Kay's conversations, or you can kind of take it off. Oh, sorry. Oh, that was yeah, we're out. Oh, that's good. That's a pretty normal. That's a pretty normal thing for that kind of thing to happen. So, what do you think about this quote? Characteristic posture, lovers face to face, that of friends side by side. I actually think this is actually one of the gems in the piece, remembering where we are in our culture as sort of a Anglo-American culture. What do you folks think? Is this a valuable thing, and is this divided in gender, or is sort of Trevor right that women actually tend to be able to kind of abandon the common goal and just share time together in our culture a little bit easier than men? Yeah, and we'll talk maybe about till we have faces. Yeah, go ahead. Emily, do you want to share? Yeah, you're muted there too, so you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, well, I like to think about this in context with some of the other things that he says about friendship, especially with like when he's talking about not being interested in the person or their personal life. You just spend all your time talking about whatever you're both interested in. And I see that more in early friendships, and as the relationship goes on, like the people that I have strong relationships with now, yes, we may like to talk about things, but I'm definitely thinking more about like doing things with them for the sake of the relationship, not for the sake of some sort of passion that we share. So at some point, I think that it like the seesaw kind of tips, and it becomes more like a romantic relationship in that sense.
Yeah.
But I do think that this kind of dichotomy he's setting up does have value. I don't know if it stays that way forever.
Yeah, and that's an interesting developmental thing. And maybe the question, Emily, that we will want to ask is, maybe Lewis, this is a great, these constructs and the quotes are great. Maybe the question is, should we push it? Are we pushing it too much? Maybe is always maybe one of the questions that we might kind of have. Okay, so we have actually two responses to that, Kay and then Liz. If we responded to this, if you have a new idea, I may hold off just for a sec to make sure we're through there, but go ahead, Kay, first. Yeah.
I was actually going to suggest that Liz go first since I've already talked a lot.
Well, is your oh cheapers, Liz, it says your hand was raised for 10 minutes. Have you been waiting for 10 minutes to talk?
No, I just put it on.
Okay, I thought I was paying attention to that, but oh well. Since you guys are fighting over it, I'll let Liz go.
Well, I was actually gonna go to a different thing, so
okay. Well,
Oh,
Yeah,
never mind that. I take it back.
well, let's go back to Kay. Why don't you say your thing, and then we may use Liz to pivot. And one thing, just looking at the time, I want us to be sensitive. I would like to come to. I'm not going to teach anything about today's gender and sexuality construct. If you didn't know that that has shifted since 1958, I would encourage you to look on Wikipedia or something, right? So things have changed in culture. But how do we read this in relationship to the, 60 years later, how do we read this text? I want to think about that. So I do want to pivot in that direction. So if comments can move us towards that direction. But Kay, do you want to respond to kind of the things that we've been talking about, Emily, just what she just talked about? That'd be great.
Yeah, I don't find this distinction particularly that it rings true so much, at least in terms of my own experience. In like my experiences with romantic and non-romantic loves, friendships, connections, these things seem to not be very clearly delineated. Like I just in any relationship that I have, I dip in and out of these types of things. There are shared interests. There are, the talking about the relationship itself, about the person, whether or not I'm romantically involved with them. That those things all come into play. So it's sort of, it's not quite clear to me what the distinction serves, like what use it serves when it doesn't really reflect what I've experienced in reality in terms of how human relationships have worked for me.
Well, it's an interesting comment, and the lines may even blur depending on our culture. Although I have to say, has anybody like I've never asked like somebody out friend-wise like I've asked somebody out date-wise. Do you know what I mean? Like, and I've never had to like, we don't have to update our Facebook status on friends, like we're friend, you know what I mean? So I want, there is still some kind of distinction there, but on my deepest friends, I actually, go to the point of, when I know that they need something, I will try and meet that need relationally, or, they're going through a hard time, or they need support, or, we just need to play cards until they talk, right? So there are those kind of distinctions there, yeah. So anyway, it's a curious thing, and the conversations are, okay, so some comments here. My husband and I, Emily, have asked other couples out on dates, right? And was that like a step, Emily, that you had to do, kind of an emotional step, or like a courage thing, like asking someone on a date, or is it like intentional? Yeah. And then we have Kay's actually, no, I mean, I have, like, I've confirmed. So I've just never, it's a little bit courageous, definitely intentional. So yeah, so maybe we're kind of a little bit more intentional. I love our coffee culture today because it gives us this moderating space. Let's go for coffee. A friend, someone I work with, I was like, oh, let's go for coffee sometime. He's like, and he answered in such a funny way. He's like, I really like to drive and take pictures of things. Let's do that. And all of a sudden I was kind of in this space. I'm like, well, this is more commitment than I was looking for, right? So I guess we have to navigate those things on their own. So we still have Liz kind of like ready to pivot us a little bit. David, did you have a thought about this particular conversation? Or
I was just going to say that when Lewis is talking about Storge, he compares it to gin, that it's a drink in its own right, but it's also a base for cocktails. And I think that's probably true for all of the natural loves. That they can be bases to varying degrees and complement one another.
Yeah, and to be fair, he went from, with Joy, his wife, he went from her being an enjoyable literary conversation partner to a friend, like just what he talked about in the text, to a lover. Right. So for him, he went through that process too, so that he saw those things. Yeah. And yeah, Kay, that's right. It is that's a nice quote. So we want to go to Liz here. Did you have a thought? Do you want to share your thought now, Liz? Because I'm ready to kind of pivot if you are.
Yeah.
So.
Well, it is about Joy, so it was perfect that you brought her up. So you had said that she probably had a lot of input in him putting this together.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that he had said that kind of irked me, but I let it go until you had mentioned that she'd probably been part of this, is that he had said something early on in the book about, you know, I can talk about what men were probably like way back in the, you know, hunting days, but as I'm not a woman, I can't talk to you about that. As if somehow his line to the past, like of prehistory, exists because of his gender. And
Yeah.
if that's the case, which I don't accept at all, if he worked with his wife, it seems like he kind of made like this statement of this is going to be from a man's point of view solely, totally, and completely, and yet he had a woman that was probably working with him, and why did he not leverage that maybe more?
Yeah.
He had that resource right there.
Yeah, just to kind of confirm this, like, for you. So we have like 59 occurrences of the word man in the lecture, right? Men would be another 27. That's a high number of occurrences. Like, this is a very masculine text, right? So he's it's really funny the way that he wrote it, because he's really speaking as a man to men and expecting women to kind of listen in, right? It's an unusual rhetorical style, and I'm not even sure that's a 1958 style. It's probably a 1948 style. I don't know. I just don't know. Yeah, and you know, Kay notes here, you know, like, this is, I wish that was not par for Lewis's course. And to be fair, the first feminist critic I read, Rosemary Radford Rother, I was so offended by her masculine language that I set the book aside for a while, right? It's hard to stomach. But I'm curious, Liz, so that's actually a step we have to take, right, as readers, if we're going to go to 60 years back to this Lewis moment. Are we willing to translate? Because when he says men are man, he often means humanity or human, right? And he only uses the word humanity here to describe humanity as like a lived experience of what it means to be different. Humanity itself, something that moves past the biological. He even talks about violence to our humanity, right? So he only uses human or humanity in that kind of way, which is the idea, the essence of living, not the people or the person. So we have to make that jump. But I mean, are there any anthropologists in the group? How strong is Lewis's anthropological approach in the text? Because this is kind of at the heart of Liz's point, you know, he's using, you know, his experience as the gateway to the entire human past. Is that, anthropologically, is that a strong move, or is that actually problematic?
Can I continue speaking just to like add on?
Yeah, and anybody else can raise their hand and join in, or push back if you like.
Well, what's I think interesting is that, you know, he was willing to talk about subjects that his lecture series didn't even actually make it out, right? They heard what he was talking about and were like, yeah, no.
It was just
so
too sad.
You would think that if, you know, he's talking about human relationships across the board in every facet that he can, you know, that he's trying to really work with this and human relationships. So you would think that for someone who wrote Narnia and who wrote Till We Have Faces, and is able to, in those instances, write from a female perspective,
yeah,
why could he not do it here?
Yeah. Can you think of the simple answer for that? I mean, the simplest answer. It may not be the right one. I mean, the simplest answer, Trevor, do you have a thought, or? Yeah, you're muted as well too. So
okay, sorry about that. I just wonder if he's trying to not speak about things that he doesn't feel like he knows personally about.
Yeah,
I don't see him men addressing men. I see it more like, this is me talking about what I know about, and I'm not going to presume to try and speak for women, and it's a little bit, that's still a little bit of a problem, I think, because he's still seeing everything's divided into male and female.
Yeah.
Men do this and women do that, and I think that's a little, I don't know if offensive is the word, but maybe it was just a thing that was more present back then than now.
Yeah. Okay. So we're actually going kind of in two directions. And Hannah, your hands up. Is that I noticed you threw a comment in. Is that that kind of an accident, or do you want to speak to the moment at this point? Because I do want to bring in, yeah. So can you hold that previous point just for a second, Hannah? Then, so what we have in the comments here are people, pushing back, and we've got two things happening. One is saying, Lewis, so there's the masculinity is universal kind of thing. So it's pushing back a little bit on what you're saying, Trevor. And we do see, right, that man is the preferred gender, man is the preferred stance. And I think, folks, that this is just rhetorical for the most part. That's just how he thought public conversation went. Gentlemen, is kind of how it went. I just wish it was, it was other, right? I don't know that it was the standard, but I suspect it's pretty BBC-ish for the 1950s. I suspect that he's not that far out of his cultural moment. But then there's the question of universality, and there's really kind of an interesting tension I want to bring up. One is that, Noam's like, look, this approach doesn't describe all men in his time, let alone in all times, right? So let's be careful about that. But also, on the other hand, I think that's important to say, is that he sometimes had a limited view about what is universal. That was kind of what I was hinting at with his word thousands, that I don't know that Lewis had the fullest view. And there's a social scientist named Mary Sue Van Leeuwen, who has a whole chapter in her book Sword Between the Sexes that takes all of Lewis's anthropological points and then says, look, I'm a social scientist, let's look at his point. And here's, where he's strong, here's where he's weak, here's where he guesses right, even though he didn't have the evidence, and here's where he's totally off because he didn't ask more people. He didn't find a more universal experience. On the other hand, Lewis is ahead of the game in what we call autography or autoethnography, using the self as part of the evidence of how we think and feel. That's how he wrote. That's how people are writing today. That's actually how anthropology is often practiced today. And Lewis was really ahead of the game. He apologized for it in his talks and essays and on stories. He says, I'm afraid I'm going to have to use my own experience because it's the one I know best, but here it is. This is how I read. That's actually a pretty common thing. That was pretty unusual, I think, in 1939 or 38 when he gave that first lecture. So I think the tensions on both sides, I think there's an interesting push and pull. Noam, let's make sure your mic's on. Why don't you go ahead and speak to us, Noam?
So I want to actually emphasize the other part in his essay. He starts by sort of giving a logical, from his perspective, logical argument of why we should consider the four loves. Mm-hmm. He goes, it's from the language, we shouldn't ignore the language is important, and that's it. So he does try to sort of, at least in the beginning, says we have a universal framework that we can work with. And I think that we would all agree that supposedly universal framework doesn't actually work and doesn't make sense even from within that framework. So he fails on that account. I think he also fails in realizing how human relationship changed throughout history and specifically since the Industrial Revolution. The fact that people in his time, in our time, are marrying because of love and not due to financial constraints is a new phenomenon. It didn't used to be that way. It used to be that you had to marry whoever was financially good match for your family, because that was a crucial part of your substantial life, material life. And he doesn't take into account the city that estranges people. If you live in a small village, you know the baker, you know the shopkeeper, you know the life, you know the people you hang out with. One of the things that sociologists point out about the city is that that's exactly what you lose when you move to a city. You don't know the grocer, you don't know the people in front of him. You're a stranger. There's an estrangement going on. So that get lost. I think there's more to be said about that, but I would like to stop here and hear other people's thoughts about it.
Yeah, no, that's good. And I do want to get back to Hannah, who has a point on something different. I want to just restate something Noam just said. And so to give some history, Noam, I think, is quoted as saying, this is a terrible, terrible book. Am I quoting you correctly? No?
Yes, there might be a few more terribles in there, but yes.
So Noam and I don't see exactly eye to eye on this particular text. However, this phrase, "the city that estranges people," that's a pretty gorgeous phrase that you just said. Also a pretty terrifying phrase, terrible in the old sense, right? I would like to agree that Lewis misunderstands when he universalizes some parts of human experience. He misunderstands. I still think there's value not just in the bits of these talks, but actually in the framework of thinking about love, even if it means like what Kay is suggesting, which is actually these lines blur more in distinction, and that's actually to me helpful once you create exceptions, once you redefine things. I think it's helpful to have those to push back on. So I actually think Lewis had almost no concept about the city that estranges people. I think he lived in little towns his whole life and always intended to. So yeah, I mean, he felt estranged, but he largely did that to himself, ideologically speaking, on campus in Cambridge or Oxford. So that's a different thing too. All right, Hannah, let's go to you if you want to speak to this point. If you can still recall 10 minutes later what it is that you were trying to respond to. I'm sorry I missed you. And you'll have to unmute yourself here also. So.
Hi.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Yeah, I have to go. My lunch break's over in 3 minutes, but just really quickly, the first point I wanted to make was about in regards to being face to face and defining the different types, or understanding the different types of love. I think in response to a previous commenter, the reason that we make that distinction, like you were saying, between asking someone out as a friend or in a romantic context, is that there's an inherent risk involved. There's an exclusivity for most ethics, traditional ethics in regard to sexual and romantic relationships. So the exclusivity automatically implies a type of risk and vulnerability, whereas one can have multiple friends. And you can only really look one person in the face at a time. So I think that was kind of my response to that. And then the second point was just about agreeing, I think, with Trevor that that really universality is nestled in specificity. So I think actually where Lewis fails is when he tries to be universal and inclusive with, applying it outside of him being Lewis and his specific situation. Whereas maybe if he had written the book just about his experience of those types of loves, say just with joy, that would have been more universal by just doing that. And he succeeds in doing that when he writes for Lucy and Narnia, or when he writes for Orwell in Till We Have Faces. So anyway.
Because he allows those stories to be those stories, right? Like, they get to speak. Anyway. Well, thank you. Yeah, and you have to,
I think so.
Yeah, you
I have to go. Yeah.
All right. Well, no, I'm glad that I got to you. Sorry that I was brushing past too quickly there. So
Oh, no worries.
yeah, good stuff. And I want
Thank
to
you.
repeat the phrase that she just said. Universality is nestled in specificity, and I said it correctly, I think, and which pleases me. So yeah, and Kay says kind of gives an amen to that particular phrase. It's an interesting thing, and of course, if he's working in this autographic genre that people are still working out, we can understand why there might be some awkwardness there. And this is kind of how I like to critique Lewis, is on his own terms whenever possible, right? Rather than pretending I have some God's eye view on the whole matter. However, like what is it? Is there anything that you want to bring up that you find troubling or distancing, or that he's been prophetic on, that you think that this moment in our culture really needs to hear this kind of thing? Granted that we may have, a handful of countries represented within this culture. Yeah, okay, so some hands here. Go ahead, Trevor, first. Yeah.
So I'll just throw the hand grenade in the room.
Yeah, sure.
We had talked in our class about the passage, which I can't seem to put my finger on right now, where he talks about the roles of husband and wife in marriage, and he kind of makes this point, which is a little disturbing, that feminists should not begrudge us our crown, because from the pagan point of view, it's a paper crown. From a Christian point of view, it's a crown of thorns. I just find that a little, it just seems to me to be of the times, and maybe not, I think from my point of view, I don't think that more than 1 out of 20 men can really pull that off well. And so I believe that we need to teach our children and to learn ourselves a more egalitarian way of doing marriage.
Yeah.
I just don't think that most people, it puts a lot of pressure on men to pull off this righteous, self-sacrificing king role. And I think Paul himself hints at something beyond that when he talks about submitting to each other.
Yeah. So to be fair, yeah, okay. So there's a few different ways here. I want to just note here. Kay says, one, what does feminism mean? And I think, in feminist, in Kay's definition here, isn't give us your crown, right? Which would be falling short. Like if women were trying to be like men in 1958 or today, that's a pretty low bar, right? Or even to get man stuff or something. Although equality movements on like pay and things are important, legislation are important, but that the question is, should one gender rule over another? And I think that's what feminists would want to push back on. But it's interesting, why did Virginia Woolf and Dorothy Sayers push back on the word feminism? Because I think there was in that generation, the word feminist was being used in ways that we have fuller definitions on right now today, at least if we're listening to second and third and fourth wave feminists and what they're talking about. We want to have a fuller definition, or I hope we would have a fuller definition of it, right? So there's that problem, right, is what we mean by a feminist. And then the question of rule or submission is one too. So Lewis talks about the crown of thorns, because the husband, excuse me, I'll just find it here. Nothing will rise that has not in some degree shared the crucifixion, as his principle of love, right? So in this lecture series, in the book, the idea is that all love in a sense must die to itself, that if you've given yourself over to mothering a child, or to being the perfect son, or being the perfect lover, or having the perfect job, or whatever the thing that you're in, you actually have to lose that to yourself. You have to give that up, and it has to die in order for it to rise and be filled with divine love. That's the principle that's in this thing, and so he has that idea. So that's the principle. So everything must die, like all things must die, and that in the agape section, all love subsumed to divine love, which is modeled by the cross, the self-sacrifice, the giving over for the self. But he also says, headship, male headship in this case, is fully embodied in that man whose marriage is most like a crucifixion, right? Well, I mean, I said this in class, but would not it be meaningful if the woman was also self-sacrificial? Is the cross not a model also for children as well as parents, for business partners? You know what I mean? And so that's Trevor, where I think that he's limited, is that he hasn't taken this idea of the cross as model, self-sacrifice, self-giving, dying to self. He hasn't taken that and moved that out into all areas. He's kept these kind of special categories of men and women, protected from that in a certain kind of way. Do you know what I mean? Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I mean, I see where you're coming from, and I think that that's definitely a part of all of this, but from my perspective, in order for marriage to work, there has to be self-sacrifice on both sides.
Yeah.
And I don't think there can ever be, one gender that's supposed to, you're supposed to be the Christ figure, and your wife, she can get away with less than that. I think both are called upon to be like Christ. And if that's the case, then why do you have all of a sudden this little hierarchy, this almost human hierarchy that's been sort of dumped on top of this very beautiful idea of both people being Christ-like? And I apologize for speaking a little bit more negatively of that relationship than maybe it's lived out in practice at times.
No, that's all right. And you've got some agreement here in the comment sections too. Yeah, okay. Actually, maybe I'll come back to that in a second here, Caleb. I have to think about that for a sec. But Lewis, in fact, does try to push back against himself. Like, he has this super weird thing, that so as men in a relationship, we are not just ourselves, but we're also like Sky Father. Like, we're all of masculinity, in symbolic form brought into the single moment. Is that right?
I think he's saying that because he's a Oxford Don rather than any real. It just seems to me the kind of thing an Oxford Don would say.
Maybe. I wonder if he's just kind of lost in the myth, is all I mean. I'm not like, it's not very often. I didn't even know who the Sky Father and the Sky Mother or Earth Mother were when I got married. So with due respect, I wasn't enacting them very faithfully, apparently. But I guess I don't want to take all masculinity into myself in every relational encounter that I have with my wife. And I guess I don't know what masculinity and femininity mean exactly in this moment, right? So he has a meaning. I don't know if everybody has that same meaning. And then he kind of pushes back against himself, as of course we remember, this is play. We can't push this too far, because you can't give to another human being this self-surrender that only belongs to God. So it's an interesting pushback, but I don't know if he pushes back all the way. I don't know if he's consistent enough. All right, so a couple of comments here. Caleb notes, Lewis's comments ring of youthful love. His love was young and he was still learning. That's an intriguing comment, of course, right, on somebody who's in their late 50s, right? They're 60 when they're writing this, but youthful love is as youthful love does, right, Caleb? And so it's okay here, and so it's okay is going to give kind of a little quote. I don't have the full quote either, Kay, but but it is in that Mary Stuart Van Leeuwen book. But I just on my blog, pilgriminarnia.com, I just put up a C.S. Lewis and gender bibliography to share with you all just before before the session started a couple of hours ago. So you can always just check it out at pilgriminarnia.com. And this is September 17th, 2019. So you can check that post out, and you guys can use that bibliography as you like. After you spend a year or two reading, you can always get back to me on everything you know or write about it. But somewhere it is true, Kay says, that Dorothy Sayers says that Lewis talks a lot of nonsense about sex. I think it was she means like sex as in like genders, like as in, you know, men and women, right? And then you always think about that when he comes to this book. However, to be fair, Kay, Lewis, you can speak to this, Kay, if you like, but Lewis did, Dorothy Sayers really did appreciate the way that Lewis used the gender play in Perelandra, where he turns everything upside down and suggests actually that our bodies are not really, you know, the key thing, but there's something behind the body, something like universal gender-wise that we live out. That's the real reality, and our bodies are kind of incidental. That they happen to be male or female is not as important as the masculinity and femininity. And behind that, that's an interesting reality in Perelandra that I think the transgender community are trying to kind of talk about a little bit in their much different way. So go ahead, Kay. Before I get into this.
There's also this really brilliant letter interchange between the two of them.
Yeah.
I don't remember the exact quotes, but Lewis wrote to her and was like, really, you must give tongue about this whole nonsense of women being allowed to, you know, be priests in the church. Like, this is a horrible outrage, but I can't say that because I'm a man, so you should say it. And he's like trying to make her into a hired gun. And she basically writes back and is like, I don't agree. Like, in fact, isn't the whole point that we're all supposed to be able to do something like that? Like, saying, well, they can't be the figure of Christ because they're not male.
Yeah, and
he's like, dude.
So the essay, it's Lewis's. It's not his worst essay. His essays are short, and so they can sometimes be too trite, but it's one of his worst, and it's on priestesses in the church, right? Which even the language is there. But yeah, Dorothy Sayers pushes back on the question of women in leadership in the Anglican Church in two ways. She agrees, you know, yeah, this could divide us from the Roman Church in a way that in a global community and history, and it's poetically less elegant to have women as priests. But she agrees in all the other way that women could be in leadership. You know, she thinks, and Lewis's response is kind of interesting. We don't have the whole thing, but he just kind of shrugged and they just moved on in their letter relationship, right? Like, okay, so and Lewis wrote the essay anyway for himself, and then wrote to her and said, well, I hope I didn't mess it up too badly, basically. So yeah. So anyway, thanks, Kay. Okay. Yeah, and so I think you're going to find Anglicans in a different space, although the Roman Catholics aren't, you know, in a terribly different space than where Lewis would have been in 1958. But yeah, and that's the weird thing about Lewis, right? Is he's got this kind of upside down view of gender and sexuality in a lot of ways. He does these, like, Till We Have Faces is an amazing experiment in gender characterization. And is actually a great book to read with the Four Loves. And in fact, I make an argument that that the Till We Have Faces is the encapsulation of Lewis's conversation with the Sheldon Van Auken, when his partner Davy died, when they were both kind of young in their relationship, 10 or 15 years into their relationship. And then Till We Have Faces is a working out of that. So this is Till We Have Faces, and then the Four Loves is bringing those lessons together once he's learned something about erotic love that he didn't know once he experiences it himself. So that's kind of my argument that I make somewhere. So, all right. Well, we're coming to the end of the time. Is there anybody kind of been sitting on their hands? They just kind of wanted to say something. and they'll just feel better if they have said it, because I don't really want to cut it off too early and leave people without having spoken, but I'm sensitive to the time. And we do want to, like, in a little bit, actually, just in a little while after we finish here, I'm coming back to my class. We're gathering together. We're talking about Plato's Symposium and the Hebrew Song of Solomon, the poem. And actually, when you read Plato's Symposium behind the four loves, you can kind of see that lovers face-to-face moment is a really interesting thing when compared with one of the speeches in the Symposium. So they kind of can be read together. All right. So any last comments that you want to give? Hands up or anything?
I wouldn't mind coming in at some point, Brenton, but I don't want to skip the line. If anyone has any last thoughts.
No, this is it. You jumped
this is my moment.
Jumped the queue.
Firstly, I think that was a really fascinating discussion. And I don't think you missed anything. So I was looking at the comments. The only thing was Caleb said, I almost feel as if those things people mistook as homosexual leanings seem more like storge relationship within friendship. This was a comment from quite a while ago.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you saw that. And I'm not proposing that we reopen that area of discussion, but I did, when Trevor referred to the hand grenade, of this text, I thought Trevor was going to be talking about Lewis on homosexuality, because that's a whole topic that occurred to me when I was listening to these talks. And actually, there's some quite interesting differences in the radio broadcast compared to the book on that topic. But I just thought I'd mention that in case you missed that comment from earlier. The other thing I just wanted to say was about that conversation about friendship, which I thought was really interesting, because for me, the big fantasy in a series like Harry Potter is not just going to school in Hogwarts, School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, but having friends like Ron and Hermione. And also, I want to have friends like the Friends on Friends, the TV show. There's a lot of kind of TV and book series that are really about friendship, and I would also say Lord of the Rings, the Fellowship, particularly Sam and Frodo is this great kind of example of friendship. Funnily enough, I don't think of so many examples in C.S. Lewis's work. I don't think of the Narnia series as really about the relationships between the children in Narnia. It's more about the goal that they're trying to achieve. But I just wanted to sort of chime with other comments when people were saying that there's a kind of yearning for friendship, and this is something that C.S. Lewis talks about, and actually puts that friendship love on the same level. I mean, that's the great genius of this work. I think of the great thing about it is that he's talking about eros, agape, philia, and storge really on equal footing. He's giving as much attention to all four of those, and so often when we talk about love, even in 2019, we're really only talking about one or possibly two things.
Yeah, and I still think that a lot of our mainstream film is still really just about erotic love and not about friendship. We'll talk about that in our class a little bit. I think you're right, and one of the things I miss in the Harry Potter films, right, is you lose that daily, in school rhythm of friendship, and that are in the books, and the films that just kind of, it's just rushed. However, the lesson that they have to learn in Harry Potter is one of friendship, right? Is that something what you were going to say, Trevor? Or
yeah, I think the thing about Harry Potter and friendship is that's one of the most appealing parts to it, and I think that one of the reasons why it's been so popular is the fact that there are these close friendships, and not just Hermione and Ron. Harry, there's this very poignant scene that always makes me cry a little bit when we learn that Neville Longbottom has been carrying his Dumbledore's army coin with him for many months after the army disbanded, because he just wanted to cling to that friendship that he had known.
Yeah, and when Fred and George, they're brotherhood is more than a brotherhood, right? It's clearly a case as Neville with a bunch of exclamation marks, the real hero of the series. I think Fred and George are more than just brothers, they're friends. Kay notes here about the appealing nature of friendship that goes beyond gender, that we have this kind of hunger there. Noam says that some of what makes these friendships is that the people stay together in close quarters. Yeah, there is kind of a trap thing. And Noam also noted Spartans, which is in the lectures series of Four Loves. Lewis notes that, you know, a lot of the, you know, the great male friendships of history would have had an erotic element to it beyond the friendship, and there is that there. Well, you know, here we are. We're at the end of the time. I want to honor the time so that we can be done here. I just want to thank everybody and just give a couple of notes here. If you haven't connected with Signum University or Mythgard Academy, Mythgard Academy has a ton of free academic level resources that help us read well and read deeply. So I encourage you to take a look at that. Look at those things, including a bunch of things from Kay says, thank goodness we were able to entirely figure out human relationships tonight. Yeah, it was good. It was a good night, including Professor Corey Olson and his token stuff. So that's in Mythgard. If you're interested, I think Signum University, I don't get paid to say this, but I get paid occasionally, is just this amazing experiment in deep reading and interconnected intersectional reading that brings life and text together with society, culture, fan culture, geekdom, and the things that we love to do. If you're interested, reach out to me by email or through Twitter or something, and just make sure that if you want to plug in as a listener, as a student, as a volunteer, then you have a chance to do that. There will be more of these. This one was kind of a bit ad hoc. I don't know if there'll be more open classes like this, but there are Signum Symposia on the way throughout the year where we'll have different events, including our normal. Is it in October or November where we have kind of like, we break out all over the place with Signum University and do kind of some special events whenever possible. Yeah, so thanks to you all. Thanks to Gabriel, who sat in the wings, sort of our Top Gun reboot, Signum style kind of moment here to make sure that everything went well. And thank you everyone for respecting one another even with hand grenades in the room, right? So, and you should all think of the song Hand Grenade as we sign off here. It's a good love song, right? Terrible, great pop love song. So, all right, thanks everyone, and we'll see you on the other side. Take care.